Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the next episode of Navigating Net Zero, where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next on the journey to net zero for the economy, for companies, and for the globe. My guest today is Lyrica McTiernan, who has spent more than 15 years helping companies build and grow their sustainability programs. She was one of Facebook's first sustainability hires, where she spent nearly a decade shaping the company's strategy and later led sustainability partnerships at WeWork. Today, as an independent consultant and with someone whom I have the great privilege of working closely with on a number of projects, she draws on that experience to guide organizations through the complex world of corporate sustainability. Lyrica lives in San Francisco with her family, and I'm just delighted you could join us here today on Navigating Net Zero. Welcome.
Thanks, Alexia. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Lyrica, I think like many of us are sort of, and you, I think especially, are long in the tooth on corporate climate action and really thinking about kind of the role of sustainability professionals and that work broadly. Tell me a little bit about your previous role and work at Facebook and then at WeWork and how you've seen the space evolve over the last now 15 years of your career.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. So I was hired originally by Facebook back in 2010, which feels like an eon ago in the sustainability profession. So much has changed since then. So when I was first hired, there was no sustainability team at Facebook. So I came in the door originally as a contractor. They didn't have any headcount. This was something that they were really just starting to think about. When I walked in, they knew a lot about efficiency, and energy efficiency was big front and center for them from a data center perspective, but anything else having to do sustainability was not. And so when I came in, that was my purview originally, was help us figure out what we should be thinking about from a sustainability standpoint and starting from scratch. And it was a really fascinating journey. So really starting from the ground up and starting to build a whole program there at a company which at the time, there were only about 2,000 people working for Facebook. So we think of Facebook as a really large company, now Meta, but at the time it was small. And so really starting to think about like, what are the key things that really should be on our radar? Renewable energy. Hey, maybe we should start thinking about investing in renewable energy since data centers are using so much energy. And so that was our starting point. And from that, we looked at what small incremental wins we could get under our belts to start building momentum within the company and building out a sense of political capital that we could then use to build the program more broadly. And it took a little while because building respect within a company that's growing so quickly takes time. And so it was a really interesting journey starting to establish sustainability as something that should be respected and should be a key piece of the strategic considerations that go into how to think about data center siting, how to think about energy procurement, how to think about how to show up in the world in local communities. And interestingly, at Facebook, it really did start within that infrastructure team. Different companies, sustainability starts in different places. And based on where that team takes its original foothold, that really does determine what some of those original priorities will look like. So by the time I left in 2019, 9 years later, we had a really strong, robust team working on a number of different projects. We had sustainability councils internally, we had partnerships, we had a whole bunch of different things. And I made the jump to WeWork, where I started their sustainability partnerships program, and then very quickly also took on a lot of that initial sort of setting the groundwork, doing a materiality assessment, doing the little nuts and bolts of what you really need to do to set up a comprehensive strategy. And then from there, I left the corporate America, and for the last 5 years, I've been having a really wonderful time jumping in and helping out in an independent capacity in a number of different initiatives and projects, both for companies directly and also for multi-stakeholder initiatives. So it's been a really fun journey.
That's amazing. And I will want to come back to a few things you said. But one of the things you said, I mean, I would imagine in 2010, there really wasn't a lot of guidance out there for companies in terms of what right looked like as you're crafting this strategy. So talk a little bit about what were the external sort of sources you were looking to help inform and calibrate your direction of travel, and how did that then sort of translate into the engagement and outreach you did inside of the company to build momentum and buy-in for those strategies?
Yeah, it's a really great point. There was not a lot to look to at that point. Back in 2010, trying to figure out how to set strategy and how to set priorities was a really complicated and non-obvious exercise. And so one of the very first things that I did was look around and say, how do we even know what to prioritize if we don't know what our impacts are? And so one of my very first projects was learning how to do greenhouse gas accounting, because I didn't know how to do greenhouse gas accounting when I walked in the door, but very rapidly it became apparent that understanding what our impact looked like from a greenhouse gas standpoint was really a critical first step. And so that very first time round, I opened up a new spreadsheet and I started from scratch, and I worked with some consultants and I made some tables and gathered some data and put this thing together piece by piece, and used that combined with some initial sort of forays into the world of materiality as the starting point for how we should prioritize what projects would even make the most sense strategically. But to be honest, it was really hard to do that because the guidance was often a bit murky, and it was so early in the journey for so many people, at least here in the US, from a corporate sustainability standpoint, that looking around at our peers, they were very similar to the position that I was in, really just starting their journey. And so it was a long, slow process of starting to look at what really does make sense first. And for us, that really was energy, because it became very apparent very quickly that was a huge percentage of our footprint, at least for scopes 1 and 2. I will say, when we first started out, scope 3 was so difficult to measure that those first few years, we didn't even do a comprehensive scope 3 footprint, which I think was quite common back then. We picked 3 categories that we could get data for, and we went with that. And it was things like corporate travel and shipping for data center components. But then we kind of stopped there because we said, well, clearly there's going to be bigger impacts elsewhere, but we have no idea how to even go about thinking about collecting the data. So we'll say that and leave it there. And it's been really interesting to see from 2010 where that was acceptable, frankly. And we were pretty clear about it. We said, hey, we're cherry picking these data points because we do not have any additional data to give you. And then going from that point to today, where there's no way that would be acceptable today for a company to just take a few scope 3 categories and leave the rest to the side, because there is more data available today. Not that it's perfect, and we can go into that if you'd like, but it's been really interesting to see what the expectations have looked like as they shift over the last 15 years related to scope 3.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the scope 3 measurement is actually really a bright spot, in that I think people really just in the last few years have started taking a much more serious look at what their scope 3 emissions are and start really digging into the data and figuring out, okay, what can we do in this space in terms of engaging our suppliers? But I want to come back to this broader point on data, because I think it's a really important one, and one that's often underappreciated in terms of its importance, which is just the fact is that these are all almost always estimates derived from a whole bunch of different models and data sources and bills you collect and receipts of things that you purchased. And I mean, there's this big long list of this sort of messy set of inputs that sustainability teams have to sift through and sort through. And the GCP must have just come out with its first set of, I was trying to remember when the GCP protocol for inventories was published. I think it was right around then. So were you guys using that to do that first inventory?
We were. And yeah, I don't remember what year it came out either, but I believe it was new and we were using it. And it was very helpful. But to be honest, reading that scope 3 protocol, all of the guidance around scope 3, it just felt so hypothetical because the things that they were suggesting and mandating in terms of data requirements, there was no way that we could fulfill those.
Yeah.
And so it was nice to read, but we ignored most of it and took what we could given what we had. And then over time, continued to build that out. And so over time, we added more and more categories of Scope 3 impact. And so now, of course, as you can imagine, there is a completely robust accounting of Scope 3 and a lot of really detailed work that's going on there, which is amazing to see.
Yeah. And tell me, so you sort of figured out where your material sources of emissions are. And I assume when you say materiality, you mean order of magnitude relative to all of your emission sources, right? Like this was a material source of emissions for the company. And you are kind of doing that. Did you then say, okay, we should set a reduction target? Or what was the process for actually thinking through kind of what your action agenda and prioritization looked like?
Yeah, exactly. So that very first year, a lot of the work that we did was focused on getting an initial set of data out there and then weaving it back to the energy efficiency narrative that was so important to the company even before I walked in the door, because it was such a key part of what it meant to build and manufacture their own data centers. Was energy efficiency is key, and they had some amazing technology and some amazing narrative around work that they were already doing. And so that was our starting point. And then from there, we layered on top this idea of renewable energy and saying, yes, the cleanest electron is the one you never use. Absolutely. It's great that you start there. And inevitably, you're going to need to use some energy. You're going to need to power these data centers with electricity. And so what if you were to use a source that was cleaner? And we went in that direction. And then thinking about how to reduce emissions that had nothing to do with electricity, frankly, came a little bit later because electricity made sense as the first big thing to focus on. Once we had a renewable energy strategy in place, then we started to look about how to reduce the other types of emissions. And that's when we started to think about Scope 3 and Scope 1 and all of these other impacts. And this was before SBTI was a thing. But once SBTI came on the scene, we did go ahead and create a science-based target and look at reducing emissions in that way. I think it was around 2017. Yeah, the last couple years that I was at Facebook, that's when we started to actually, for the very first time, put together our science-based target. And it was a helpful lens through which to view the work that we were doing. I don't know that it is in and of itself sufficient to be able to get us to where we need to go from a global emissions reduction standpoint, but it was certainly an interesting lens through which to view the work.
Absolutely. And while we're nerding out on target setting and accounting stuff, I want to ask you a question around, like, Facebook was obviously going through just huge amounts of growth at that time, right? So I'm sure as you were doing your projections and looking at the business model growth, there was a very likely pretty steep increase in emissions over time. And for a lot of the hyperscalers and the folks who are really growing incredibly rapidly, that upward trajectory of your emissions is very real. So as you were looking at setting absolute reduction targets, how did you guys think about the fact that you were going to be seeing such intense growth and bending that curve downward while recognizing that it probably wasn't going to register in terms of absolute reductions inside of the company that would show up in your inventory for quite some time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's an incredibly difficult challenge that companies face when they're growing very rapidly. And there were a few different things that we did. And one was, frankly, making sure there was a narrative around reductions and context. So we had a line that we really liked to use talking about how, the emissions from one person's use of Facebook, if you are somebody out there in the world using Facebook, and the emissions behind that is less than the emissions that it takes to get you one latte, an entire year of Facebook, and kind of trying to put that into context for people. Then, of course, the natural follow-on question would be, but wait, how many people are actually using the platform? Millions? Billions now? That's a lot of lattes. And so your point is a good one, and one that was a really complex one for us to try to address, which is, it's a lot of lattes. So maybe one person's use of Facebook for the year has fewer GHG emissions from an impact perspective than one latte, but it's a lot of lattes. So, so what then? And for us, the interesting thing that happened was the timing of our initial science-based target coincided with a whole lot of renewable energy procurement that was underway. And so we were able to leverage the fact that we had some really amazing projects coming online just at the moment when we were setting our science-based target, which allowed us to do that. Frankly, if the timing had been different, and if we had already done the amazing work of identifying really high impact renewable energy projects, and if they had already come online, and we weren't able to set a baseline year that was prior to that moment, it would have been very challenging to set a science-based target. And I think this highlights one of the things that's particularly tricky with something like a science-based target is that depending on when you find a company in its life cycle in terms of its own sustainability journey, and depending on how much work the company has already done to reduce emissions, the science-based target may or may not tell you, and their ability to meet it may or may not tell you the full story in terms of the value of work that company is doing.
Yep. Totally. And I think this is a real point. I mean, it's a very technical point, right? Which is that as you're thinking about how your company is going to grow and where your emissions trajectory is going, and you're thinking about that trajectory relative to an emission reduction target you may have set, to your point, the baseline matters hugely, right? Like when you're setting your base year and what the assumptions that are going into those baseline projections, and then how you're measuring on an annual basis progress towards bending that curve down. And I think this is actually one of the things where we're really going to run into trouble and are running into trouble with the current construct under the Science-Based Targets Initiative and some of the other target setting frameworks, is that if you cannot figure out a way to accommodate and recognize the fact that these very high growth companies are not going to be showing absolute emission reductions in their inventory anytime soon, and maybe not ever, and that really the climate contribution that they're making is those avoided emissions over time, which are very real atmospheric benefits, we're going to have a really hard time keeping any of these companies in the boat. And I think that the companies, those super high growth companies, which is mostly who we're talking to right now, are the ones that are going to help continue to play that leadership role. And so how do we structure an accountability framework that really recognizes that those avoided emissions really do matter, and they require real work and investment and engagement. And we have to create space for that, but we also do want transparency around that. And I think that's definitely one of the things that we've seen, is that there's a high degree of variability in terms of transparency, and that a lot of companies are benchmarking both their programs, their ambition, and what they say publicly to their peer group. So maybe you mentioned earlier that a lot of your competitors and peers were in a similar stage, right, of just kind of starting to think about this. In the absence of that really clear benchmarking, what was the conversation you had internally to say, look, we should set ambitious targets, and like, this is what we should calibrate those targets against prior to some of these external standards coming online?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of it came back to doing a lot of foundational legwork internally to figure out what the priorities were for the leaders with whom we were engaging internally. Because I think a lot of times people don't necessarily realize that a lot of what it takes to be a successful sustainability professional within a corporate setting is being excellent at change management and being able to understand what the real priorities are for the leaders around you, and then be able to draw a clear line from the work that you know is going to have the most impact from a sustainability standpoint to the priorities of those leaders, and be able to identify how to actually tie to their existing strategy. And so a lot of the work that we did prior to there being like really clear external benchmarks and expectations was all about figuring out how far we could push the needle while being able to do it in such a way that aligned with the strategy that was already underway. It's like, you can't stop the train. Once the company is moving in a certain direction from a strategy standpoint, that train is not going to take a U-turn and go another direction because of sustainability. However, if you can dock another car onto that train that has to do with the strategy that you know is going to have the greatest impact from a sustainability standpoint, then connect that train car on there and it will go right along with the rest of what the company is trying to do. And so a lot of it came down to just being really strategic about which initiatives to push on, understanding that you couldn't do everything all at once, and really prioritizing the things that were going to have the greatest impact from a greenhouse gas perspective.
Absolutely. And I think that is such an important point, and one that I think was also often underappreciated and under talked about, generally speaking, is that in companies, sustainability is almost never the decision driver, right? It's your executives are making decisions based on a whole bunch of exogenous factors that have nothing to do with sustainability most of the time. And I love your analogy of docking on the train car, because that is the path to success. But that's not always easy, especially when you need people to change behavior, or you need them to adopt a newer and riskier technology, or the thing you're asking them to do costs a lot more than what they're doing normally. So how did you guys navigate that, especially in a time where renewable energy in 2010 was still a lot more expensive, right, than most of what you could get off the grid, and we didn't have really large green power purchasing programs? So how did you guys sell that strategy internally, and what did that process look like?
Yeah, it's very true. And the way I sometimes think about this is that there are a whole lot of different levers, and senior leaders at companies are working on making sure all of these things balance. And you've got a lot of different stakeholders that you're managing, and a lot of different reasons that strategies might succeed or fail. And so what we would often do is take a big step back and look at the things that some of these senior leaders were keeping track of, whether it be local community engagement, or whether it be policy, or whether it be any host of things that might make it more challenging to get things done. And again, going back to this idea of like tying the sustainability implications of the work that we were doing to what those stakeholders might feel based on what we did or didn't do from a sustainability standpoint. And one of the things that proved to be incredibly helpful and effective was realizing how much local communities cared about sustainability in some of the locations where we had a physical presence, either from an office standpoint or a data center standpoint. Because those community relationships are so incredibly important strategically, and being able to show up, I mean, talk about energy, but also talk about water, right? Think about the local community impact of a whole bunch of different environmental sustainability impacts that can be managed really well or really poorly based on how a company shows up in a community. And so tying the work that we wanted to do to these sort of key stakeholder perceptions was really key.
So I want to come back to this point of kind of an inside and outside game, because I think it is really an important thing for the environmental community to be conscious of. I think there's often this sense that companies are these big, sort of monolithic, impenetrable entities that are out there doing this work, and really it's people inside trying to drive change and really advance these agendas that sometimes conform with core business objectives and sometimes don't. And so threading those needles is, I think, a continuous challenge for our space. What do you think sustainability leaders really need to understand, or maybe do differently than we do now, to maximize their influence in the rooms where decisions are made? And I guess building on that, how do external pressures help you do that work better internally, or not?
I think it depends on the type of pressure, because there's pressure that can make someone dig in their heels. And then there's pressure that can make someone realize that maybe if they do something in a different way than they had been previously, everyone benefits. And corporate leaders are smart, right? You don't rise to a really strong leadership position within one of these companies from not understanding how decisions are made, right? These are really intelligent humans who are leading these companies. And so what I have found is, as a sustainability professional, I've always been most successful when I've started by really looking around at the leaders who were in front of me and understanding them as humans, both from the perspective of what matters to them professionally, from the perspective of what language they speak. And when I say that, I mean, is it the language of accounting? Is it the language of real estate? What room am I actually in? And then calibrating my own language and calibrating my own perspectives and even the types of things that I would bring up to discuss with these leaders based on the room that I knew that I was in. And I think for all corporate sustainability professionals, that's one of those key skills that can often make the difference between walking into a room and getting a no and walking into the room and getting a yes, is are you able to make a connection with the human who's sitting across the table from you and do so in an authentic way? It's not about manipulating them. It's about understanding them. And it's about creating a platform where you can work together so that everyone benefits, so that they can go down their path with a greater level of success and that you can too. And going back to this question of pressure, when you have outside pressure that comes in such a way where when you can use that to demonstrate to a leader across the table from you that there's a path that maybe they didn't see before.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess building on that, what are some of the challenges that you faced in the early days that sustainability executives are still grappling with today? Because as you were talking, I was like, wow, some things have changed, but some things really haven't. So just reflect a little bit on today in 2025, where are we in terms of gaps that we need to be addressing and filling and things that you wish were clearer as you're engaging with your clients and partners to enable them to take faster, more ambitious, bigger action?
Yeah, it is really challenging sometimes to understand where the guidance is going and what the expectations truly are for what good looks like from a strategy standpoint. And that can be incredibly difficult. It was difficult in 2010, and it's still difficult today because sustainability professionals inside companies, in order for them to be successful, they have to build trust with their corporate leaders.
Right.
And they have to build up their own personal brand inside a company so that corporate leaders know that this is someone they can trust to give good advice and good counsel on the direction the company should take from a sustainability standpoint. And if the landscape of standards and guidance is shifting under the feet of corporate sustainability professionals, it makes it incredibly difficult for them to show up internally in a consistent way. And they risk losing that credibility. And if they don't have credibility internally, if they're viewed as someone who says the company should go and spend $1 million over here on this project because the guidance says that's going to be something that will be required, but then 6 months later, things change and that was no longer a necessary investment. The next time that sustainability professional goes and asks for $1 million, they're going to get a very different reaction than they did previously. And so that's what worries me most, to be frank, is like, you've got these amazing sustainability professionals who have worked their way into positions of respect within companies. And the last thing that they need is to be undermined by perhaps the best of intentions, but nevertheless, by changing standards and changing expectations externally so that they lose that credibility, and that would make their work so much less effective.
Yeah. And I think this is such a tension for the environmental and climate change advocacy community broadly, right? Because we want to hold these big, hugely profitable, high-emitting companies accountable. And we want them to be going as fast and as hard and as big as they possibly can. But to your excellent point, your professional reputation is on the line. And I certainly experienced that, where you're looking at the array of available options to you as a sustainability executive and saying, okay, I can spend the $1 million on, I don't know, let's say carbon credits or not. And when your company gets splashed across the front page of The Guardian, it is deeply damaging internally to your professional standing, to the team that really put that money on the line, made that decision, sold the strategy inside. And I think this inability we have at the moment to figure out like what good enough looks like from a claims perspective and from a standards and guidance perspective is actually really hurting us, because for the first time in the history of the environmental movement in 2020, 2021, with the ascent of net zero claims and commitments, we were about to mobilize real money for the first time in the history of the environmental movement. And then we decided it would be a great time to rewrite all of the standards from scratch. And so we've I think collectively been mired in this just uncertainty, grappling with big, hard, very legitimate policy questions, but questions that are jeopardizing the commitments and targets that these sustainability executives have put their professional reputation on the line to sell internally, and jeopardizing people's ability to write checks, which I think is what gets most frustrating to me. Is there's so many no-brainer things that companies should be doing, and because we don't have the sophisticated data systems, because we can't connect the dots within our supply chains to do the accounting in a credible way, we are, I think, collectively just slowing this transition that we know is so urgently necessary in the climate crisis. And so I think the work that you and others are doing to really help build certainty and bridge across is critically important. So can you offer some reflections around what type of clarity you think would be most helpful for companies moving forward, and how we can, I think, hold those two truths, right? The need to hold companies accountable and the need to celebrate and applaud what is big risks for internal teams. Like, how do we hold those two things together in a credible way?
It's a really great question, and it's an incredibly important one. To me, a lot of it comes down to transparency. And at the end of the day, the reality is the standards ecosystem is evolving and it is moving, and there are a lot of uncertainties right now. And unfortunately, I don't think that's necessarily going to change anytime in the immediate future. Maybe soon, maybe hopefully, but regardless of that, if there is a way to have clear, transparent disclosure from companies about exactly what they are doing and exactly what context they are doing that work in, anything else can layer on top of it. And regardless of where you find yourself in the world geographically, regardless of what sector you are in, regardless of your peer group, if there were a clear, consistent way to disclose the work that you were doing, the impact that work was having, and the context of your emissions as a whole, and then clarify which additional standards and guidance you were perhaps layering on top of that and why, then I think that would provide a lot of specificity and a lot of clarity and a lot of respect. Because I think so often what I see is people are losing faith in each other and accusing each other of greenwashing and accusing each other of trying to obfuscate data or not doing the hard work and trying to get off easy, when really I think a lot of it could be clarified by saying, no, we're not trying to say these two things are the same. We're saying these two things are different things and they both matter. And here is a clear representation of what the impact actually is of each of them side by side. And I think that has been a really challenging gap in the space.
Well said, and couldn't agree more. And I think there's a number of new advancements in this space that will hopefully help. And I think that the emergence of corporate regulatory disclosure rules too, I think over time will help address this as well, because we have relied on voluntary standards and the nonprofit sector to such a high degree historically around a lot of this stuff, particularly in the US. And I think that's also going to start to change here as companies and as countries get more serious about Article 6 implementation. But there's no doubt that those are enormous gaps that need to be filled.
I think the other important thing to keep in mind is we don't have time to wait. And we don't have time to nickel and dime ourselves and say this is 50% right, but 50% wrong, or 80% right, but 20% wrong. We need to be doing everything we possibly can do as quickly as we can do it, and being as transparent as we can be about the impact that we expect it to have. Different people might have different theories of change, and that's okay. We need to be working as quickly as we can across the board globally.
Absolutely. What's one lesson from your kind of sustainability journey and career, and particularly as you've moved from being in-house at a huge global brand to starting your own consulting business. What's one lesson from your journey that you hope the next generation of sustainability professionals take with them from this conversation and into their work moving forward?
I would say continue to approach the work with curiosity and with the assumption of best intent. It's really easy to misunderstand each other. This is complex stuff. It's messy, it's nerdy, it's complicated. There are no hard and fast answers to a lot of these questions yet. And so approaching the work with optimism and asking hard questions, but assuming that the people around you might also be doing their best to solve these problems as well, I think that goes a long way.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And what's one thing that's keeping you up at night, and what's the thing that's giving you hope these days and keeping you in the fight?
One thing that keeps me up at night is this question of, are we going fast enough? I think there are a lot of folks who are doing this work who are deeply motivated to do it right. And there are a lot of people who hold on very tightly to their own personal theory of change. And if someone has a different one, they go out of their way to talk about why that's wrong. Because a lot of these people who are doing this work, myself included, it's like we're nerds. And there's a lot of really smart people who have their own specific idea about how to solve this climate crisis. And I worry that we will get lost in the 10% where we disagree instead of focusing on the 90% where we do. And that will slow us down in a way that we just cannot afford. And what gives me hope is that because these people care so much, I think we can make it to the end. And I think we can focus on that 90% where we do agree. And I think we just have to agree together to put our differences aside and move forward, because we can't afford to do it any other way.
Hear, hear. Well, Lyrica, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. And thank you so much for joining on this episode of Navigating Net Zero.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.